Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that warm the heart and challenge the mind. Today's story is one of compassion, injustice, and sweet redemption. It begins with a white waitress who showed kindness to two poor brothers, feeding them every day for 2 years. But when her actions were discovered by a racist manager, the consequences were harsh and unjust. However, what follows is a tale of resilience, loyalty, and the power of rising above prejudice. Stay with us as we take you through this incredible story of kindness repaid in ways you won't expect. If you enjoy stories filled with unexpected twists and inspiring moments, be sure to comment below, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another heartwarming tale from Hopeful Horizon. And let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The sun was just starting to set over the small town of Bridgedale. Tucked away on a quiet corner, Joe's Diner was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, with its faded red and white sign and worn leather booths. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, drawing in regulars and travelers alike. At one of the back tables sat Sarah Williams, a middle-aged white waitress with warm brown eyes and a heart full of kindness. She had been working at Joe's Diner for nearly a decade, serving up more than just meals. For her, it was about making connections, offering a smile, and in some cases lending a helping hand where it was needed. That's how she met David and Michael, two young black brothers who had fallen on hard times. David, the older of the two, was around 14 when they first started coming in, always looking out for his little brother Michael, who was just 8. They would slip into the diner quietly, never asking for much, but Sarah noticed the hunger in their eyes. They didn't have enough money to buy even the simplest meal. One night, after her shift ended, Sarah saw them lingering outside the diner, staring at the glowing "open" sign. "Hey, you two," she called out gently, stepping out into the cool evening air. "Why don't you come inside?" "I'll get you something to eat." David hesitated, his dark eyes filled with a mix of pride and embarrassment. "We don't have any money, ma'am." Sarah smiled. "That's all right. I'll take care of it." From that night on, Sarah made sure David and Michael had something to eat every day. For 2 years, they came in after school, sitting in the same booth by the window, eating whatever she could sneak to them. Whether it was a plate of scrambled eggs or a sandwich, Sarah always made sure they had something. Her kindness never went unnoticed by the boys. David, though young, understood what she was doing for them, and he often thanked her quietly. "We'll pay you back someday, Miss Sarah." I promised she would smile at them and wave it off. "Don't you worry about that. You boys just take care of yourselves, all right?" The diner's manager, a man named Gary, had been with the place for as long as Sarah could remember. Gary was a large man with thinning hair, always sporting a scowl, and he was known around town for his short temper and narrow-minded views. He ran the diner like a drill sergeant, barking orders at the staff and keeping a close eye on everything. Gary didn't particularly care for Sarah's way of doing things. To him, the job was about serving customers and making money, nothing more. He didn't see the point in wasting food on those who couldn't pay, especially not on the likes of David and Michael. Though he had never said anything outright, Sarah knew his feelings. One evening, as Sarah was placing a plate of food in front of the boys, Gary stormed out of his office. His beady eyes locked on them, and his face turned red with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice booming through the diner. Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her calm. "Just getting these boys something to eat." "Eat?" Gary spat. "They're not paying customers. You've been giving away food to these kids for how long now?" Sarah stood her ground, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're hungry, Gary. It's just a bit of food. We've got plenty—" "I don't care," he interrupted, his face twisting into a sneer. "This isn't a charity, Sarah. We're running a business here, and we don't need their kind hanging around, bringing trouble." David's face hardened, his fists clenching under the table. "We ain't causing any trouble, mister." Gary glared at him. "You're trouble just by being here." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Gary, that's enough. These boys—" "I said enough," he roared. "They're out of here, and if I catch them here again, I'll have the cops called on them for trespassing." Without another word, Gary reached for David's arm, yanking him up from the table. David resisted, his voice rising in protest. "I didn't do anything," Gary sneered. "Yeah, tell that to the police." Gary, without hesitation, dialed the police. The diner grew quiet as customers watched the tense scene unfold. David, still being held by his arm, stood rigid, eyes filled with a combination of anger and fear. Michael, younger and smaller, looked up at his brother helplessly. "Please," Sarah said, stepping in front of Gary. "This isn't necessary. They haven't done anything wrong." Gary's face hardened. "I've had enough of your excuses, Sarah. These kids have been eating here for free, and I bet this one's been stealing from the back." David's jaw dropped. "I never stole anything," Gary scoffed. "Right? Because you just expect free handouts?" He turned to the police officer who had just walked in, pointing at David. "That one's been stealing food from us for 2 years. Arrest him." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "That's a lie," she yelled, stepping in front of David. "He's not a thief." The officer looked uncertain for a moment, but Gary was adamant. David, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained silent. He didn't want to cause any more trouble, and he wasn't sure what more he could say to change the outcome. Before long, David was handcuffed and led out of the diner. Michael tried to follow, but Gary shoved him back. "And you, stay out of here," he spat, his voice full of venom. "Both of you stay away." Sarah turned to Gary, shaking with anger. "You had no right to do that." Gary sneered. "I had every right. This is my diner, and I don't tolerate freeloaders or thieves." Sarah couldn't hold it back any longer. "They were never stealing. I gave them food because they were hungry. You can't treat people like this." Gary's eyes narrowed, and with a calm cruelty, he said, "You're fired. Pack up your things and leave." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to cry in front of Gary. She knew this day would come. Gary had never liked her, and this was the excuse he had been waiting for. Without another word, Sarah gathered her things, gave a reassuring nod to Michael, and walked out of the diner she had worked in for nearly a decade. Time passed slowly for David and Michael after that night. David was sent to a juvenile detention center, his innocence overshadowed by Gary's false accusations. In the years that followed, Michael struggled without his brother by his side, but he was determined to make something of himself. He worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and studied hard. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Michael had become a successful businessman. He built a tech company from the ground up, using his wit and determination to rise above the poverty he and David had once known. Throughout those years, he never forgot about his brother, who remained unjustly imprisoned, or Sarah, the waitress who had shown them kindness. Meanwhile, David's time in prison had hardened him. He spent his days working out, reading, and planning. He knew that when he got out, he and Michael would make things right. The injustice they had suffered weighed heavily on his heart, but it also fueled his resolve. One day, Michael's persistence paid off. With his connections and newfound wealth, he was finally able to secure his brother's release. David, now a man in his late 20s, walked out of prison a free man. But freedom wasn't enough. He wanted justice. David and Michael sat together in the sleek office of Michael's tech company, overlooking the city skyline. Despite their success, the shadows of their past still loomed large. The pain and humiliation of being kicked out of Joe's diner by Gary, the racist manager, was something neither brother had forgotten. They hadn't spoken much about it in recent years, but now it was time to confront that chapter of their lives head-on. David stared out at the city below, his jaw clenched. "We're going to make him pay," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Gary thought he could ruin us. He didn't know we'd come back stronger." Michael nodded, leaning back in his chair. He was the mastermind behind many successful ventures, but this one felt personal. "We will, and we'll start by buying the diner." David raised an eyebrow, surprised. "The diner?" Michael leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Yeah, we're going to buy Joe's diner, fire Gary, and give it back to the person who deserves it, Sarah." A slow smile spread across David's face. The thought of finally being able to repay Sarah for the kindness she'd shown them all those years ago filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction. I like it. It's time Gary learns that the people he mistreated aren't the same boys he kicked out. The brothers had come a long way since those days. Michael had built a tech empire from the ground up, and David, who had faced years of hardship after his wrongful arrest, had found his own way to success in real estate. But no matter how far they'd come, the sting of their past still lingered. Gary had tried to tear them down when they were most vulnerable, and now they had the power to change everything. The plan was set in motion. Michael, with his financial resources and connections, quietly began the process of acquiring Joe's diner. It didn't take long. Joe, the original owner, had been looking to sell for years, and Michael's offer was too good to pass up. Within a matter of weeks, the paperwork was signed, and the diner was officially theirs. David and Michael couldn't believe how quickly it all came together. Every detail was falling perfectly into place. Michael had kept their identity as the new owners a secret from everyone, especially Gary, who still ran the diner with his same bitter attitude. The brothers decided that they would personally visit the diner on the day of the takeover to witness the moment Gary realized who now owned the place he had once ruled with an iron fist. As the day of the takeover approached, the brothers sat together in Michael's office, discussing the final steps. Michael was cool and calculated, while David, though he had matured over the years, still held onto the fire of righteous anger that had been ignited the day he was arrested. "We'll go in tomorrow," Michael said, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I want to see the look on his face when he realizes what's happened. It'll be priceless." David smirked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. He's going to regret everything he did. It wasn't just about firing Gary. It was about reclaiming their dignity and righting the wrongs that had been done to them. But perhaps the part of the plan that meant the most to both brothers was the chance to repay Sarah. She had risked everything for them, and though she'd been unjustly fired, they would make sure she was rewarded in ways she never imagined. "Sarah deserves this," David said quietly. "She gave us so much when we had nothing. It's time we gave something back." Michael nodded. "She's going to be the new manager. That diner will be hers to run, and Gary won't be able to stop it." As they wrapped up their conversation, the weight of the past seemed to lift slightly from their shoulders. The next day, they would confront their history and take control of the future. For David and Michael, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, redemption, and repaying a debt of kindness that had stayed with them for years. The brothers' journey toward reclaiming their dignity was about to reach its climax, and soon the tables would turn in a way that neither Gary nor anyone else in the diner could have anticipated. It was a quiet morning at Joe's diner. The hum of clinking dishes and low conversations filled the small space, the same as it had for years. Behind the counter, Gary, the manager, barked orders at the staff as he had always done, his face twisted into the same scowl that had become his signature. Little did he know that his reign was about to end. David and Michael entered the diner, their eyes scanning the familiar space. Despite the years that had passed, nothing had changed. The cracked leather seats, the faded sign above the entrance, it was all exactly as they remembered it. But today, they weren't here to reminisce. They were here to take control. "Are you ready for this?" Michael asked, his voice calm but filled with anticipation. David nodded. "More than ready." As they approached the counter, Sarah, the former waitress who had been fired for helping them, entered through the back door, unaware of what was about to happen. She looked older, wearier, and her clothes weren't as neat as they had once been. Life had clearly taken its toll on her since she'd lost her job at the diner. When her eyes met Michael's, confusion flickered across her face. She hadn't seen either of the brothers in years, and now they stood before her, dressed in fine suits, a far cry from the poor boys she had once fed in secret. "Michael? David?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Michael smiled, his eyes softening as he spoke. "We've got something to tell you, Sarah. This place, it's ours now." Sarah's mouth dropped open in shock. What? What do you mean? Before Michael could answer, Gary stormed over, his face red with anger. What's going on here? I don't need you wandering around, Sarah. You were fired, remember? David stepped forward, his presence commanding. She's not fired anymore, Gary. In fact, we're here to make sure you're the one leaving. Gary's eyes narrowed, confusion mixing with anger. What are you talking about? You can't just walk in here and... Michael cut him off. Actually, we can. We own this diner now. As of this morning, the paperwork was finalized. Joe sold it to us, and from now on, we make the decisions. Gary blinked, his face paling as the realization hit him. You own the diner? Michael smiled coldly. That's right. And the first order of business is to let you go. The diner fell silent. The regulars stopped eating, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Gary, the once powerful and domineering manager, was now powerless. His hands trembled as he tried to maintain his composure. You can't do this, Gary stammered. I've been running this place for years. David crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. We can, and we are. You treated people terribly, Gary. You hurt the ones who helped you build this place, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. Gary looked around, desperate for some kind of support, but there was none. The same employees who had feared him now looked relieved. No one was coming to his defense. Not even Sarah, who had been quietly watching the confrontation unfold, said a word. With a huff, Gary turned toward the door, his face red with humiliation. You'll regret this, he spat. You won't know how to run this place without me. David chuckled. We'll manage just fine. Gary stormed out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling as it closed behind him. The moment felt surreal. Years of anger and bitterness toward the man who had wronged them faded as David and Michael stood victorious. After Gary's departure, the tension in the diner melted away. Michael and David turned their attention to Sarah, whose eyes were still wide with disbelief. Is it true? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You own this place now? Michael smiled warmly. Yes, Sarah, it's ours, and we want you to come back. Not as a waitress, but as the new manager. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. Manager? I don't know what to say. David stepped forward, his voice gentle. You don't have to say anything, Sarah. You deserve this. You stood up for us when no one else would. You helped us when we had nothing. This is our way of thanking you. Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand, overwhelmed by emotion. I never expected anything in return. I just did what I thought was right. And that's exactly why you deserve it, Michael said. People like you don't come around often. You showed us kindness when the world was cruel. Now it's your turn to be rewarded for that kindness. The staff, who had been watching silently, erupted into applause. Sarah looked around, tears still streaming down her face as she smiled. For the first time in years, she felt valued. She felt seen. Under Sarah's leadership, Joe's Diner became a symbol of community and kindness. The changes she made transformed the atmosphere from one of fear to one of inclusivity and respect. Customers who had once been regulars returned, drawn by the warmth and compassion that now defined the diner. David and Michael remained involved, visiting frequently, but they trusted Sarah to run the diner as she saw fit. For them, this wasn't just about revenge, it was about righting a wrong and making sure that good people were rewarded, not punished. As the weeks passed, the brothers reflected on their journey. They had gone from being two poor kids kicked out of a diner to successful men who owned the very place that had once turned them away. And through it all, they had never forgotten the kindness of the one person who had believed in them. And so, from the ashes of injustice, David and Michael forged a story of resilience, redemption, and the power of kindness. Their journey from humiliation to triumph is a reminder that no matter how dark the past, the future can always be rewritten. Thank you for joining us on this incredible story of perseverance and justice. If this story moved you, Please comment below and let us know where you're listening from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another inspiring tale from Hopeful Horizon.